Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks very much for joining this evening. My name is Peter O'Shaughnessy. I'm a front-end engineer and a partner at the John Lewis Partnership. This is an organization with a history stretching back over 150 years, and it includes a couple of well-known retailers here in the UK, John Lewis and Waitrose. And this talk is about our journey migrating the Waitrose.com website to React Node and microservices, with a smorgasbord of 10 lessons that I have learned along the way. There is a food theme with images of some dishes very tenuously related to the content of the talk. So apologies if anyone's feeling hungry. I hope you can grab a snack or get some dinner afterwards. Okay, our story begins in the year 1999 when Waitrose.com first launched. A fun fact, it wasn't just a website that Waitrose launched back then, but also a free internet service provider. The following year, Waitrose entered the world of online grocery deliveries with a limited service called Waitrose Deliver. And in 2001, they began a partnership with a startup retail tech company called Ocado. This helped to boost Waitrose's own efforts and enabled them to be one of the early frontrunners in supermarket e-commerce in the UK. For example, together they launched the very first UK supermarket iPhone app, I believe. But now we fast forward to the spring of 2016. Waitrose.com had by now been running for quite a few years already on a monolithic e-commerce platform from IBM called WebSphere Commerce Suite. The website code had become a spaghetti of customizations and enhancements, and it was becoming harder and harder to maintain. Releasing an upgrade had become a massive event which took weeks of prep and testing. And on the front end, the website wasn't responsive or optimized for mobile phones at all. So a wise decision was made to explore moving to a modern architecture with a React front end and microservices running in the cloud. A few colleagues formed a team and they started working on a proof of concept front end based on a boilerplate project from Erik Rasmussen called React Redux Universal Hot Example, which included React Redux Node Express Babel Webpack and hot module reloading. The boilerplate project had been started the previous year, and its README said at the time of writing, all of these libraries are right at the bleeding edge of web development. I personally believe that this stack is the future of web development and will survive for several years. Well, it's definitely no longer bleeding edge, as I'm sure you will agree, but a spoiler alert, it has ended up surviving for several years for us for the most part, but more on that later. Another wise decision was taken to not build the whole new website in isolation and then try to switch everything over in one go, but to gradually migrate over piece by piece as much as possible. The homepage, trolley page, and product pages were some of those earlier pieces to get moved over. And they weren't just moved over to the new architecture and moved over to the cloud, but to a new responsive design at the same time. So it looked like this. So now the major pieces left to move over were addresses, login and registration, orders, including the whole checkout flow and feeding into our order processing systems, and slots, as in delivery and collection slots. And later on, we would split out and bring forward addresses and login and registration in a couple of separate releases. So we were left with orders and slots remaining, and this is what we called Project Summer. And this is where I entered the story myself in November 2018 when I joined Waitrose, and specifically the team building out online checkout. We weren't just building it like for like though, but we had a brand new design too, shown here. It was only really 3 pages though. The checkout page with some modal windows on top for things like entering gift cards, an optional payment authentication page for 3D Secure, which is that extra verification step you get with your card provider, and the order confirmation page. And the team already had a lot of this set up by the time I joined. So I didn't imagine it would take nearly 2 years for these 3 pages to get fully into production. But spoiler alert, it took nearly 2 years for these 3 pages to get fully into production. And that brings me to my first lesson learned of the evening. Beware user interface icebergs. Some user interfaces appear quite straightforward on the surface, but their complexity goes much deeper than you might imagine. And that's useful to remember, especially when it comes to any longer term estimating or planning. And yes, that is a dish of iceberg lettuce you may just be able to see in the background. Thank you for noticing my subtle puns as we go through. To give you an idea of the size of our checkout iceberg, for just those 3 pages of our new checkout user interface, we have over 60 different error scenarios, over 180 functional tests, and over 2,000 unit tests. A colleague of mine put it well recently when he said, the unhappy paths end up taking 3 times as long to develop as the happy paths. It also reminded me of that 80-20 rule where you feel like you're 80% complete in 20% of the time and the last 20% takes 80% of the time. Another thing that I totally underestimated was accessibility. I had the unfortunately naive idea that if you used semantic HTML and you didn't do anything weird, then you'd end up with your website being pretty accessible by default. I was wrong. So my lesson learned too is if you're not doing manual accessibility testing, it's most likely inaccessible. And I specify manual testing because most of the guidance out there says that automated testing can only pick up somewhere between 20% and 40% of accessibility problems. So it's only through testing it manually that we can find most of the issues. And it's only through testing it manually that we can really start to understand what the experience is like for our customers. So if you're not using the keyboard, not using a screen reader, or not viewing your pages with a magnifying tool, then the chances are it's going to be really difficult for customers using those tools to navigate your website. And I learned that as soon as you start developing in-page interactivity, as in you're building a web application as opposed to just static pages with hyperlinks in between, then you're on your own for a lot of things. You need to start handling a bunch of things yourself, like maintaining focus in the right place and managing scroll positioning and more. And this is explained very well in an article by Nolan Lawson called What I've Learned About Accessibility in Single Page Apps. We've got the link here, but I should note that I can share these slides and the links I've included afterwards, after the talk, in case you wanted to jot any of them down. And then there's everything in the user interface which makes sense when you can see it, but it doesn't when you can't. Like our design here for saved payment cards, it visually represents a card, which is nice for our visual users. But when we tried it out actually with a screen reader, it was a bit of a mess. For example, the card number itself was read out without any additional context as bullet, 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 9077. So we rejigged the HTML to use the definition list, and we applied a screen reader class to those elements we only want to be read out by a screen reader, not displayed visually, and the ARIA hidden property for the opposite, to display it visually but hide it from screen readers. And now it looks exactly the same, but it's read out as card number ending 9077, which is much better. So my recommendation is, if you haven't already, please do try to become familiar with at least one screen reader. Most of us at Waitrose Digital use Macs, and we're fortunate enough to have one built into our machines, VoiceOver. And we've also started using NVDA, which is one of the most popular screen readers on Windows and also free. And I've included links here to handy references for how to start using them. A nice way to spread good accessibility practices is through a design system, because you can get the accessibility right for a component once and then reuse it across your website and potentially multiple web properties. When I joined Waitrose, we did have something partway towards a design system, though no one called it that. We had a shared component library named WDX, or Waitrose Design Experience. But we weren't that great at the most fundamental aspect of a design system, having developers and designers collaborate closely together. We had our own developer-driven pages documenting our components, but they weren't really contributed to directly or referenced by the design team. We didn't really have a clear picture of what components we wanted to be in the design system or how they would fit together. And generally, it just didn't really get that much love or attention because each team was focusing on building out their own part of the website. And so as a result, we had a lot of duplication and wasted effort across our different teams. So we talked on and off for quite a while about starting again and kicking off a proper design system effort to address those issues. But for a few months, nothing happened. And I thought nothing was going to happen until we actually formed a design system team to kickstart it, which is how our colleagues in John Lewis got their own design system off the ground. But we didn't have the capacity to take people away from our product teams and still keep that project Samosa work on track. So thankfully, my next lesson to learn was you don't need a dedicated team, although we know from our John Lewis colleagues that it does help. We had a front-end lead join our team called Amos Gabor, and he also quickly identified the design system as a top priority. And he brought together a working group of people across different teams, developers and designers, and soon afterwards adding on product owners and delivery leads. We had regular catch-ups every couple of weeks, and it was focused around actions. And we got a good cadence going, and we soon had the genesis for a new design system, which is called Ingredients. It's not yet public, but here's a sneak peek. For the component library and the technical docs, we're using Storybook, which lets us easily create interactive documentation with embedded examples of our components. It also has inbuilt automated accessibility testing using Axe for that 20 to 40% of accessibility issues you can find that way that I mentioned before. And we've also added visual regression testing. We are using another platform as well for the design system docs, a platform called Frontify, which the design team were using since beforehand. And we're embedding our Storybook components into Frontify using iframes. But we're investigating at the moment whether we can consolidate everything into Storybook itself, which would be nice. We soon had enough to pave the way for the teams to start contributing to the design system themselves. And we helped them to do that by having one of us from the design system working group that I mentioned work together with each product team for a sprint. And we designed a workflow around it, which is shown here. I won't go into the detail of it, but the basic principle is that if you need a component and it's not in the design system, you should first get it in the design system, get a component in there and up to scratch, and then you can go ahead and use it. The result is not quite that we've built the whole design system out super quickly, but we have built up a decent amount of components in it and some solid design documentation while we've been delivering our features in this project Samosa along the way. And most importantly, I think we've been working a lot more closely with our design colleagues and putting more thought into getting these components right up front. Libraries next. Okay. You may recall earlier that I said our front-end tech stack had largely survived intact since we started first building that proof of concept on the boilerplate project. So 4.5 years it has survived. We have been replacing a few pieces along the way though. We've swapped Karma, Mocha, Chai and Sinon over to use Jest, which is nice because it's a bit more all-in-one and it has some nice features built in like snapshot testing, which I'll talk about a bit later. And we're also gradually migrating away from Redux forms to more of our own approach, making use of something called React Hook Form, which is quite a lot more straightforward and lightweight. And as it sounds, it makes use of React hooks, which leads me to lesson learned 4, React hooks for the win. Hooks, for those who don't know, is a new style of writing React components, which they introduced in version 16.8. This slide shows an example of a refactoring we did to switch to using hooks. I won't go through the changes in detail, but the summary of it is that it let us remove over 1/3 of the code for the component. And we've had similar results for other components too. We started introducing hooks into our code base about a year ago, and I can say it's taken a little bit of time and practice to get our heads around some of it. I've still not actually written that much code with them myself yet, but it has been going well, and I think we've all been seeing the benefits of making our code a bit less messy, encapsulating our logic together a bit more and reducing some of the boilerplate from these components. And related to that, React context for the win. The team have recently been starting to also use context provider and the use context hooks to manage shared state in localized areas of the app. And they've been finding it really helpful to prevent us from adding even more state to our Redux store, which has become very bloated over the years. An example we had was our multi-level navigation menu, which is quite complex. And to implement keyboard commands, we were ending up with refs scattered around the component tree until we moved it over to use context to maintain a list of refs and handle the keyboard events in a more contained way. There's maybe just a slight risk that we could start to use it as a golden hammer, but we'll try to apply it to places like this where it makes sense. Okay, next, some thoughts on testing after I just take a sip. Lesson learned 6 is snapshot testing for the win. I mentioned Jest and snapshot testing earlier. Snapshot testing is when you have the output rendered from your components stored in automatic snapshots. So each time your unit tests run, it can verify that the output still matches. We did debate a little bit introducing it at first because there was a question about whether it might make us a bit lazy around testing and make some of our unit tests a bit less self-explanatory and self-documenting. But from what I've seen, I don't think those fears have been borne out, thankfully, and it has saved us writing a lot of boring test code just manually checking individual pieces of the rendering output. And for functional tests, we've been using a library called Concept since before I joined. Concept gives a nice clean syntax for writing functional tests, and it handles things like waits and timeouts for you by default, which does help to avoid some of the usual flakiness of automated browser-based testing. Our colleagues over in John Lewis are using Cypress, but I understand that in Waitrose we had been using Puppeteer directly before we moved to Concept, and we were looking for more of an abstraction layer over the top of Puppeteer rather than something built more from the ground up. And Concept works with Puppeteer, WebDriver, and other browser controllers too. And by all reports from the team, it's been way better than using Puppeteer directly, although we have still had some odd flaky issues from time to time. So my lesson learned 7 is about a couple of the most common types of issues that I've seen causing flaky tests. You know, those ones that pass and everything's great, and then just randomly they'll fail and you don't know why, and then you have to kick off the build again. And your change isn't getting into production until later that afternoon. And that's a frustration, isn't it? So a couple of those common issues. One, when we're selecting an element to interact with, but the selector that we use actually picks out multiple elements, and it's not actually interacting with the one that we thought. And another one is when things have passed or failed at different times depending on the window size or the scroll position. And that's been generally to do with the elements it's been trying to interact with being, unbeknownst to us, hidden underneath modals or underneath the sticky header at the top of the site. So when these things happen, the best thing to do is just fire up the test in the GUI mode so you can see what's happening and put some pauses in and have a look. As we wrote more and more functional tests, though, the time it took to run them all started getting longer and longer until it was taking over half an hour to run these functional tests in Jenkins. So we parallelized it by automatically chunking out the different tests into a series of them and using Cocept's run multiple command. Originally, we split it into 4 chunks running concurrently in Jenkins, and the time that they all took went down from about half an hour to about 10 to 12 minutes, which was a good win. And we're now splitting them into 6 concurrent tasks, and the time they take to complete overall is about 18 minutes. So if we hadn't introduced parallelization, I'm not quite sure exactly how long it'd be taking, but it could now be up to about an hour and a half, which would be very painful. Another technology we introduced over the course of the project was GraphQL. Our primary reason to introduce it was actually just to use it as a switching layer between our legacy APIs and our shiny new microservices to give us an abstraction layer between them. But introducing this did give us some more lessons to learn. Lesson learned 9 is launching new core infrastructure probably does warrant a dedicated team. Yeah, my earlier lesson about the design system was that it was possible to develop one without a dedicated team and just distribute it amongst the teams from near the beginning. But for Graph, we didn't do that. I think we all wished that we did form an actual team around it to get it into production. And I think the main difference is that it's okay to progress the design system incrementally, but with a new piece of core infrastructure that everything's going to become reliant on, it has to be properly complete and production ready before you launch it. And another lesson I learned from our experience introducing Graph was lesson learned 10. Let the new tech bed down before expanding its use. I believe now that I was probably guilty of applying our GraphQL hammer to one too many nails too early on. Even before Graph was properly in production, we started using it within our checkout team as an aggregation layer to avoid some more complex logic where we were making and combining multiple API calls. And so we thought we'd introduce this aggregation layer to help on the front end and in the apps to reduce the complexity there. And it is working well for that, but it did slow our development down for quite a while, and it makes the whole development setup more complex. So in retrospect, I think it would have been better to get Graph doing one thing well first, its original purpose of just switching between our APIs before we started applying it to other problems. Those were 10 lessons I learned along our journey. So now let's get back to the story. In early 2019, it was confirmed that Waitrose and Ocado were going to be going separate ways. So investing in our own online shopping site, Waitrose.com, suddenly looked even wiser. We had until September 2020 to get ready to hopefully coax some of those customers over to use Waitrose.com. So we really needed to complete this Samosa project before then, get all those parts of the site migrated over to our new platform, so we had a stable platform ready in time. And then when we were just a few months away, a certain pandemic cropped up. Lockdown 1 struck, and we had a massive surge in visits to Waitrose.com. And it was a difficult time for many of our customers and colleagues. I'm sure it has been difficult for many of you too. There was one silver lining for us though. It proved really valuable for identifying our performance bottlenecks and scaling issues. That was a great way to find many of those in a short space of time. And after we battled through fixing those, we still had a lot of testing to do. In the checkout team, we'd been building out the new front end in parallel with the new backend services. So we've been doing all our development using mock services and mock data while the backend was getting built out. And when we were finally able to start hooking up to the real backend services and the real data, we discovered a lot of defects. So we needed to drink a lot of coffee, and within our checkout team only, we fixed 60 defects in 3 weeks. And so finally, on the 10th of August of this year, it was Samosa night. It was time for us to migrate the orders, checkout, and slots over to the new platform. There were over 30 of us up overnight to run through a complex implementation plan for the switchover, and it included migrating over 500,000 active trolley records. And I can say that it went as smoothly as could be expected from that. So cue celebrations in a suitably socially distanced virtual way, of course. So now we have all the major functionality of the website migrated over to React, Node, and microservices, but our replatforming journey does still continue because we still need to migrate recipes and some other bits and pieces on the site. If you were to click around on a few links on Waitrose.com, you might still see some of those pages that are still on the old design and they're still on the old platform. We also know that we still have a lot of improvements to make around things like performance and accessibility and more. But we have come to the end of a significant chapter of our Waitrose.com journey. So I was looking back at how it all began, and you might remember this picture from my opening slide about the original Waitrose.com launch. It's from our partnership magazine. I wondered who the person was in the photo, and the caption gave her name. So I thought I'd just search on our Slack just in case. And guess what? She's still with us in the partnership. So I messaged her and she replied and told me some of her memories from those early days, like the time when the John Lewis partnership website had 10 pages and the top hit was a text page on duvets. But talking of duvets, it's time I wrap this talk up and put it to bed. So thank you very much to my Waitrose digital colleagues for all their hard work along this journey. I've been on this replatforming journey for a couple of years. Some of them have been there since the beginning. Thanks to the colleagues who gave me some input and feedback on this talk. And thank you all for joining and for listening. This is where you can find me on Twitter, Mastodon, and our new Waitrose digital publication on Medium, where we'll all be blogging about all sorts of things across product and delivery and engineering. And that's the talk. So I would welcome any questions or any insights people have on the kinds of things I've been talking about today. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Well,
thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. We have a few questions people have been typing away. I think if anyone does have questions, then please could you add them to the chat window, and I'll try and compare them over to Peter. So we did have some questions during the talk. I'll scroll up for you, Peter, so you don't have to do that yourself. Someone asks, if you're starting from scratch, can you get by with just using context and use context, or does Redux become inevitable at some point? I guess there's a subtext there. When does Redux become inevitable? And I was wondering myself, are you still using Redux?
We are still using Redux, most especially because so much of the site is already using it. And so anytime we're extending something or tweaking something, adding something, it's going to be a lot easier for us to add it in our existing Redux store. We have been introducing context more in those kind of isolated areas, and we've been introducing it more when it has seemed a bit more painful to be doing things with Redux, when we've started to have to chain state going through multiple layers of components and setting up complex containers for our components and getting things passed down. And then in those cases, we've been thinking, okay, maybe it's a good idea to have a look at context and see if that can help clean some of this up. And it has seemed to be cleaning things up. I'm still pretty new to it myself, especially, I should say. Some of my colleagues have been using it quite a bit more, and they're big fans of it, which is why I wanted to include it in the talk, especially. But coming back to the original question, we haven't really considered trying to switch everything over to context. I think that would be a really big job. I'm not sure yet if it would be super beneficial versus us using Redux. But yeah, I think having a bit of both and being able to use them in different ways is working okay at the moment. If I was writing something again from scratch, I think personally probably I would attempt to just use context at the beginning, but I wouldn't be able to say at this stage where that would start to fall down or start to get messy. But yeah, if anyone else has more experience with that, that'd be really good to hear as well.
Great, thanks. And then we've got a couple of questions sort of more on the platform level. One's a kind of commercial one, and then one's about the Graphql side. One person asks, are John Lewis and Waitrose completely separate platforms? Do they share the technology? How is that led? What's the freedom each side has? And then someone asked a specific question around, are you glad you've switched to GraphQL in particular as part of that overall platform?
Cool. Yeah, I'll answer the first one first. That's a good question. Yeah, I mentioned a couple of times our colleagues in John Lewis and the fact that they were doing some things a bit differently. Traditionally, we've been actually quite separate. Waitrose, when we were all actually office-based, is based in Bracknell, where I live, and John Lewis is based in London. And we have separate offices. We have separate most parts of our platform, and we have separate code bases for the websites. But we are starting to come together more now. Funnily enough, probably helped a bit by us all going more remote, because it's so much easier for us to all intermingle in meetings and join together and share insights and share how we're doing things. And I think we're definitely going to be coming together more and combining more things over time. Yeah, we share quite a lot between both our sort of front end teams, but yeah, with separate code bases. We've been trying to learn from their design system, for example. But yeah, so far we're still on that journey towards bringing things together where they make sense. Traditionally, we've been quite separate.
Sorry, can I just elaborate on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there a lead then? Is it kind of John Lewis will lead or Waitrose will lead, or is it kind of a central team that kind of, right, you can do this now, or you can do this, or you kind of do work in two separate kind of silos then?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So there's been not very much kind of cross-group decisions in terms of you can or can't use this so far. there's more of a partnership engineering group getting set up that may make some decisions like that, but trying to keep autonomy as much as we can. And it's kind of funny in a way, because we have actually ended up with using a lot of the same technologies, even though we've been quite separate. So the John Lewis website is also React Redux based website. And yeah, I mentioned a couple of the things where we're doing things differently. They're using Cypress, for example, but many of those sort of core technologies, we're doing quite similar things. So thankfully, I suppose that helps us to think that we don't need to be too dogmatic across making decisions across both groups. But yeah, I definitely think we will move more in that direction. And we're doing that as part of a kind of grouping that we're doing at the moment, where we're all coming under the same group called the tech profession, of everyone in the engineering team. So yeah, we're definitely combining more now, and I think we're going to be coming up with more of a shared strategy going forward as well.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'm gonna try and drive the questions a little bit. I know someone wants to jump in, but I've got two strands of questions. So one's about the microservices and the GraphQL side, and I've got another strand of questions around the design system. So I want to come back to the GraphQL and microservices side, if that's okay. And so someone, going back to the question on the GraphQL, someone asked, what was your previous solution? Are you glad you switched in the long term? And then someone else asks around, in terms of the microservices backend, is that a homemade collection of microservices, or is it a commercial product that you're using for the microservices part?
Okay, yeah. So I guess on Graph, it was something that we introduced basically as a layer between the front end and the APIs, our existing APIs. So it wasn't exactly replacing anything. It was something that we introduced for this project, mostly for this migration, to help us do that migration. But we've switched things over, and we're still going through Graph. It's been useful for that switching over, but also it is helping us to actually give a little bit of a nicer API to the front end in some cases, where we want things like, I think pagination might be an example. We've got, when we're searching for products, that's going through Graph. And I think Graph is giving us back a result with the number of records that we want, and in the format that we want. And if we were using the APIs directly, it would be a little bit more work for the front end to do in the client side. There's a couple more examples like that as well. We're not really using Graph to its full power, though, I don't believe. And so there has been some questions afterwards of whether it really has been worthwhile to use Graph, or if we could have done something just quite a lot simpler, because really it's an aggregation layer, and we're not using the Graph actually connecting to the database. It's all then going through our APIs from the back of Graph. So I think we're probably not using Graph to its full power. We're not using Graph to be our whole kind of API layer, if that makes sense. It's just a layer in between.
We've got a few questions arising around kind of the caching in GraphQL. Someone asks, do you have to make more calls to the Graph API, the Graph API, GraphQL server than you would normally? Does GraphQL cache results? I guess some of that's probably more a question for the server-side team, but do you have any comment on that?
I don't think we have any additional caching layer in Graph. I mean, I don't think we have any additional caching in the Graph layer, but it's possible that I haven't come across it because it's being used for services being used by other teams. But yeah, I think we're just using caching on the front end and caching on the back end, but not in Graph, which I guess is another thing to say, that maybe we're not using the full power of Graph, perhaps.
Okay, thanks.
And,
Maybe we could. Oh, sorry. Do you want to carry on?
oh, there was another question I missed, was there?
So that was the caching. Sorry, just looking in. So it's just really whether you're making more calls for the data now that you've got the microservices in place.
Good question. I wouldn't say so, because although we're using microservices, we're also using orchestration services over the top of those microservices. So generally the front end is making a call to an orchestration layer,
Right.
and then that's calling multiple internal services to construct a response to send back to the front end.
Okay.
So it probably hasn't really changed the number of calls that the front end is making, I wouldn't say.
Yeah. Someone's pushing me again on the original question, which was around commercial tooling. Is that a commercial tool that you're using for the microservices, or is it open source?
So we are. I can't say too much about the cloud infrastructure, unfortunately,
Okay.
just because that's one of the things where I happen to where we happen to not be able to say too much, just for reasons I can't really explain. But we are using one of the main major cloud providers, and so yeah, it's using the standard constructs that we get with that cloud platform. If that makes sense.
Thanks so much. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to maybe to the design system then. So I had a few questions about the design system. One was, I think, how you keep the design system up to date with the latest components. Are there any occasions where you've added it to the main website and then later added it to the design system? Who leads the design system?
Yeah, those are good questions. So who leads it? Well, I mentioned we have a front-end lead, Almosh. He is leading it in terms of making sure that there's momentum behind it, and looking regularly at how much progress we're making with it and how much tech debt it's producing, and helping the product teams to actually pick these tickets up and work on them. And so he's kind of driving things in that sense. And we have that design system working group that I mentioned that I'm part of, where we get together with Almosh, and that's what we look at together. We try to see if product teams are having any difficulties with it, or we need to look at all at the sort of processes around it, or make some things easier to use, or just anything around improvements in the documentation and things like that. We have had times quite a lot when, unfortunately, I mentioned the workflow, where if you want to use a component, you need to put it in the design system first. I have to admit that is the ideal, but it does sometimes go out the window slightly when things are a rush and we need to get something on a website quickly. So in that case, we might just have to do something that doesn't go through the design system properly, but we should do it always knowingly and raise the tech debt ticket and make sure that it doesn't get forgotten about and languish for ages. And yeah, generally speaking, we are picking those kind of things up when we can, and it might be the next time we need to work on something, then we'll put it through the design system, or it might be that the team's got bit of capacity for some tech debt, and they'll have a look through the list and they'll pick out something that we need to get in the design system. And what was the other question about the design system?
Sorry, let me go back.
I see.
So yeah, how to keep it up to date with the latest components, I think was the other thread. And I've got another one around unit testing now, in terms of are the unit tests component driven and built into Storybook?
We do have some automated testing driven through Storybook, like I mentioned, but it's not unit tests as such. We've got the accessibility tests, which run automatically on each design system component. That's using Axe. And and we do have visual regression testing, so it spits out a visual of what those components look like when it builds, and then each time it builds it, it compares it to that, like snapshot testing, but a visual one. And so, yeah, we just update those when we knowingly are updating how a component looks. Otherwise, it can help catch if we updated how something looked accidentally. But yeah, we haven't been talking of those as unit tests. That's separate from our jest tests.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And then I think I better make this the last question, and it's around. We've got a couple of questions around integration testing, end-to-end tests, that kind of thing. So, do you use Docker? I guess Docker, Kubernetes kind of things, and do you have any kind of end-to-end kind of integration testing going on? How do you test the end-to-end flow?
Yeah. So we do use Docker. Funnily enough, we have just finally introduced ourselves a development way of running the site without Docker, because for a lot of things, when we just wanting to do things quickly on the front end, and well, we had a specific reason to introduce it actually, which was for being able to link with Yarn to our design system, and that was a bit more tricky through Docker, where we'd have to be copying in more local directories into our Docker container. So we had just introduced a way to run the site without Docker, but generally speaking, yeah, we use Docker for development and for deployment. Yes, we do use Kubernetes. That's what's running the front end and the node server. And I've forgotten what the last bit was.
It was around, sorry. So I've got another load of questions coming in as well.
Maybe
it was just around end-to-end testing, integration testing. So I guess testing the images, the Docker images themselves, and that they're working well.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we've had quite a lot of discussion about that with how we do end-to-end testing, because we've had a couple of different theories about it. One theory has been that our Waitrose.com front end is just one client of our services, and we should test them both in isolation, and we should be confident in the contract between them, which is the Swagger for the APIs. But we don't have contract testing in place yet with something like Pact, which I think we're still aiming to introduce at one point. So I think we still don't really have enough confidence in that contract that it won't miss things. So we have been pretty much doing without proper end-to-end testing, except in some sort of isolated cases. With the platform team who are monitoring the site use New Relic, but in terms of us in the front end team, we've been running tests, but with WireMock for the back end rather than actually testing against real services. But this is something we're probably looking at changing in a kind of small, contained way. But we're probably going to introduce some integration testing on an environment, and a pre-production environment that will actually use real non-prod services as well. And that is really being driven by the QA team, because they've been feeling that they've been missing this integration layer really, and that would have helped pick up more issues that we've had over the past months.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much. So I really think we've put you through your paces there. You had a good 25 minutes of questions. So I really want to thank you again, Peter. It's been a really fantastic talk. Really great to see it, the whole story, and it looks great as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting it, Joe, and thanks everyone for joining. And yeah, thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I think